Eleanor Brooks didn't ask for attention. She'd spent 72 years living with grace, building a life rooted in hard work, quiet faith, and a son who made her proud. That son, Jonathan Brooks, had clawed his way from delivery routes and broken warehouses to become CEO of one of the fastest-growing logistics companies in America. Today, they were celebrating his $900 million merger with the Montgomery family, old money royalty in Greenwich, Connecticut. Eleanor came to support her boy, not to make headlines, but what was supposed to be a private toast would spiral into a national firestorm, because someone decided she didn't belong. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The valet hadn't even shut the door behind her before it began. Eleanor stepped down from the black Lincoln Navigator, one hand gripping her purse, the other adjusting the wide-brimmed white hat that matched her cream gloves. The sun was sharp that afternoon, casting crisp shadows across the marble steps of the Greenwich Country Club, an institution where wealth was inherited, not earned, and tradition meant knowing exactly who to ignore. Her steps were slow but sure, the way a woman walks when she knows who she is. She wore no designer labels, yet everything about her whispered refinement. Her dress, a soft lilac with pleats down the middle, was pressed to perfection. Her shoes, low heels, polished, clicked lightly on the stone. She looked like someone's beloved grandmother headed to church, and in many ways she was. What she wasn't was staff. But that didn't matter to the woman in the navy blue blazer who stepped in her path before Eleanor could reach the main entrance. Not a hello, not a smile. Deliveries and catering staff use the back entrance, she said flatly. Eleanor blinked, taken aback. I'm not with the staff, she said, her voice steady but laced with a quiet disbelief. I'm here to have lunch with my son, Jonathan Brooks. The woman raised an eyebrow. Ma'am, if you're with the cleaning team or kitchen, policy requires— I'm not, Eleanor interrupted, a little firmer this time. My son is one of the partners meeting here today. The staffer's eyes narrowed, but before she could reply, another voice broke in, clear, cold, and dripping with condescension. Well, said Meredith Montgomery, stepping into the sunlight like she owned it. I suppose they'll let anyone in these days. Eleanor turned. The woman was tall, elegant in the way that only money can fake, with pearl earrings and a blouse so stiff it looked starched with arrogance. Meredith's voice was just loud enough for the surrounding guests to hear, but quiet enough to feign innocence. Are we letting the janitorial staff join us now? She added, her lips curling into a smirk as if it were a joke. Someone near the bar chuckled. A few eyes darted away. No one spoke. Eleanor stood motionless. Her hand gripped her purse tighter. She could feel the warmth rise to her cheeks, not from shame, but from something else. Not anger, not yet, just that hollow sting that came from years of these kinds of moments. That awful familiarity. And still, she stood tall. Across the patio, Jonathan Brooks was mid-toast, champagne flute in hand, smile bright, speaking to board members and attorneys who were moments from witnessing history. But then he saw her, saw the tension in her shoulders, the awkward posture of the staffer, and the way Meredith Montgomery had already turned her back, like his mother wasn't worth a second glance. His heart dropped. He didn't make a scene, didn't yell, just excused himself, set his glass down, and walked calmly, directly to his mother. Ma, he said gently, placing a hand on her arm. You all right? I don't want to cause a fuss, she whispered. I know you don't, he said, but I will. The woman in the blazer stood frozen now, red creeping up her neck. Jonathan didn't raise his voice. he didn't have to. "This is my mother," he said quietly, so everyone around them could hear. "The most important person in this entire building." He walked her back to the SUV himself, helped her in, held her hand longer than usual. "You don't need to do this," she whispered. "Don't ruin your moment." He smiled faintly. "You are the moment." Then he shut the door and turned around, back toward the crowd, the contract, and the deal that had taken over a year to build. But something inside him had shifted, something deep and ancient, something that couldn't be undone by champagne or press kits or billion-dollar valuations. Because no contract, no matter how lucrative, was worth the price of watching your mother be treated like she was invisible. And before the afternoon ended, the entire country would know it. Jonathan Brooks walked back up those marble steps with a calm that betrayed the storm inside him. He'd always known how to keep his expression level, his words measured. That's how he got this far, by mastering his temper before he ever stepped foot in a boardroom. But today, something inside him had cracked. Not like glass shattering, but like steel bending under heat. Quiet, unseen, irreversible. Behind him, the tinted windows of the black Lincoln Navigator reflected the image of his mother seated with her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her hat still sat just right on her head, but her eyes, those eyes that had always held him up, now looked away from the building, as if ashamed to have stepped inside. And that was what burned most. Inside the country club's main hall, the energy had shifted. The champagne tower still sparkled beneath the skylight. The hors d'oeuvres were still neatly lined on trays, but the guests sensed it. The subtle tension that descends when a leader's mood turns. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Laughter softened into murmurs. Even the string quartet's melody seemed suddenly too cheerful for the moment. Jonathan didn't head for his signing chair, the one in the center where 3 pens and a thick merger packet awaited. Instead, he moved toward the far end of the table, where he could see every face. The Montgomery family sat scattered like royalty at court, lawyers beside them, flanked by advisors and investment managers. All waiting. All assuming that whatever brief disruption had happened outside wouldn't affect the final act of this carefully orchestrated deal. Preston Marsh, lead counsel for the Montgomerys, stood up and cleared his throat. "Jonathan," he said with forced cheer, "everything all right?" Jonathan didn't answer right away. He took his time, letting silence do the work of 1,000 words. Then he placed both hands on the back of an empty chair, not the one meant for him, and looked out across the room. "I want to say something," he said, his voice low, deliberate. The room froze. Not in panic, not yet, but in confusion. These meetings were supposed to be tightly scripted, every speech vetted, every gesture calculated. What Jonathan was doing now, unplanned, unsanctioned, felt dangerous. "You all know what this deal means," he continued, scanning the room. "Not just for Brooks Freight Systems, not just for the Montgomery family, for the entire sector. A merger like this shapes infrastructure for a generation. That's how it's being built, right?" Nods, half smiles. More confusion. "But I'm not signing it." Gasps. A few audible, "What? Sass." Meredith Montgomery's head snapped toward him, the sharp turn of someone who's just realized the bullet was meant for her. Preston tried again, hands half raised like a man soothing a wild animal. "Jonathan, if this is a negotiation tactic—" "It's not." Meredith leaned back in her chair, that thin smile on her face like a blade hidden in a silk napkin. "Let's not overreact to a simple misunderstanding. I didn't recognize the woman, that's all." Jonathan blinked slowly. Once. "That woman," he said, "is my mother." "Yes," Meredith said, a little flustered now. "I'm aware of that. But surely, you knew what you were doing. His voice was still calm, still cool. But now, there was something beneath it. Not volume, weight. The kind that makes people sit up straighter without knowing why. You said what you meant, he added. Preston, sensing disaster, tried to pivot. We've invested heavily in due diligence on both sides. This deal is in the final hour. There are legal implications to halting now. Jonathan nodded. Then I'll see you in court. Silence. Heavy as stone. Meredith chuckled under her breath, though no one joined her. You're being emotional. That word snapped something loose in Jonathan's chest. He leaned forward, folding his hands. You think I built this company from a corner office? He asked her. I loaded trucks. I drove delivery routes at 3 a.m. I ran payroll from a card table in a storage room because we couldn't afford a bookkeeper. I watched my mother take the bus across town to clean houses, so I could keep the lights on in our apartment. The room stayed still. Even the waiters at the far wall had stopped moving. So when she walks in here, dressed in her best, proud of what we've built, and you decide to humiliate her in front of strangers for sport. His voice dropped. You didn't insult just her, you insulted me. He stood up straight again. There are deals you lose sleep over not signing, he said. This isn't one of them. And with that, he turned and walked out. No folder, no handshake, no look back. By the time he reached the parking lot, Eleanor had rolled down the window just enough to say, You didn't have to do that. Jonathan smiled, eyes still blazing. I did. The next morning, the fallout began. A local business podcast got the first scoop. One of the luncheon guests had leaked just enough to light the match. Within hours, the headline exploded. Black CEO walks from $900 million deal after mother insulted by white billionaire matriarch. It spread like wildfire. Forbes picked it up by lunchtime. CNN was talking about it by dinner. And the next day, Jonathan's walkout wasn't just a business decision, it was a national moment. But not everyone clapped. Inside Brooks Freight's New York headquarters, pressure mounted. The board was split. Some praised Jonathan's stand. Others saw only the numbers bleeding red. The phones rang endlessly. Reporters, analysts, investors. And not all were patient. A closed-door meeting was called. Jonathan, his executive team, and his cousin Darius Ingram, co-founder and COO, sat in a glass-walled conference room overlooking Market Street. We need to talk long-term, said Elliot James, CFO. This wasn't just a PR flare-up. Hathaway's legal team is already whispering breach of contract. I didn't breach the contract, Jonathan said. I defended my mother. Julian Rivera, the operations chief, leaned forward, eyebrows raised. Yeah, and in doing that, you just lit a torch to our Series C momentum. You think our lenders won't start asking questions? Let them, Jonathan replied. That shut the room up for a beat. Then Nia Whitlow, head of marketing, spoke. Calm, director. I support what you did, Jonathan. I really do. But now you've become a headline, a symbol. People are calling you the man who walked away from generational wealth to protect his mother. I didn't walk away from wealth, he said. I walked away from being bought. She nodded, slowly. I know. But if you don't control the story, someone else will. And they will, Elliot added. Trust me, we're already seeing it. 2 major investors want assurances. They're asking if emotion is guiding strategy now. Jonathan turned to the window. Outside, traffic moved like nothing had changed, but he knew better. He thought of Eleanor, the way she sat in that hospital bed years ago after her first surgery, refusing painkillers because clarity's more precious than comfort. She didn't raise him to accept comfort over principle. "I'm not teaching people that leadership means swallowing disrespect for a paycheck," he said finally. "Not in this company, not anywhere." Julian threw his hands up. "And what if we collapse because of it?" Jonathan turned back, eyes steady. "Then we rebuild," he said. "But at least we don't rot from the inside." It wasn't unanimous, but it was settled, for now. Later that night, alone in his office, Jonathan watched the sun dip behind the skyline. Messages poured in, from truck drivers in Missouri, school teachers in Atlanta, even a retired Marine in Nevada. "Thank you for not letting that slide. My dad was disrespected like that once. No one stood up for him." Finally, someone who didn't take the money and look the other way. But one message stood out. It was handwritten. No email, no phone number. Just a name. Camille Parker. "My father was the groundskeeper at Montgomery Ridge for 25 years. I saw what they did to people like us, and when you said no, I cried. Not because I was surprised, but because someone finally did it out loud." Jonathan folded the letter slowly, set it down. The fire hadn't gone out. It had just begun to spread. By the time the sun rose over the New York skyline the next morning, Jonathan Brooks's decision had become more than a headline. It was a cultural rupture. What happened on those marble steps in Greenwich hadn't just ended a merger. It had cracked open a conversation many people thought too risky to start, and even more had long given up trying to finish. It began as a whisper, just a leaked anecdote on a regional podcast out of Stamford. A black CEO walks away from a $900 million merger after his mother is disrespected by a member of the Montgomery family. No names at first, just hints. But by the second cup of coffee, the names were out. By the third, so was the footage. One of the guests at the luncheon, probably a junior analyst with a quick hand and a smartphone, had caught the tail end of the confrontation. Meredith Montgomery's voice, faint but unmistakable, laced with disdain. Jonathan's response, measured, unwavering. The kind of moment that couldn't be polished or staged. By 10 a.m., it was on Twitter. By noon, on CNN. By dinner time, the New York Times had it above the fold. But what made it stick wasn't the business angle. It wasn't even the amount of money. It was the why. A black man, raised by a housekeeper mother in Trenton, New Jersey, built a freight empire from scratch, and when the world handed him nearly $1 billion, he walked away to protect her dignity. It was too much like a parable, too clean, too rare, and America paid attention. Inside Brooks Freight's headquarters, the phones never stopped. Media requests flooded in. Cable networks wanted interviews. Podcasts begged for exclusives. Analysts wanted damage reports. The boardroom became a war room overnight. Jonathan, however, stayed largely silent. He declined every interview, ignored every op-ed request, and didn't even post a statement. Instead, he showed up at work in jeans and a sweater, holding the same cup of black coffee from the bodega downstairs, nodding at the same front desk receptionist he'd greeted for 6 years. The silence, ironically, made the noise louder. Who walks away from $900 million? What did the Montgomerys really say? Would he do it again? And then the stories started pouring in. A former employee of Montgomery Capital posted anonymously on LinkedIn. They used to make us enter through the basement entrance if we weren't client-facing that day, said it was for appearances. A Latina caterer from a 2018 charity gala at the same club wrote, "They made me remove my apron before walking through the main lobby, said it made donors uncomfortable." A retired groundskeeper's daughter, assistant Camille Parker, whose handwritten letter Jonathan had read 3 times now, shared a photo of her father, standing under a large oak, rake in hand, dignity etched into every line of his face. The hashtags "Hike walked with honor" and "Brooks stood tall" began trending. Overnight, Jonathan Brooks was being hailed as a symbol of something bigger than logistics or mergers. He had become a vessel for long, quiet rage, long-buried pride. But not everyone was clapping. Inside the Montgomery estate, an imposing stone mansion nestled in the hills of Greenwich, panic was setting in. Clinton Montgomery, the eldest son, and the only one in the family who'd ever looked uncomfortable in a tuxedo, stormed into the drawing room holding a tablet. "Mom, Tech Pulse just dropped us from their advisory panel," he snapped. "And the board at the New York Art Foundation is asking us to pause our involvement." Meredith Montgomery didn't even look up from her tea. "It's noise," she said. "Give it a week." Eleanor Wynne, their crisis PR consultant, sat stiffly at the far end of the table, flipping through a thick binder. "This is not noise," she said evenly. "This is culture, this is story. You gave them a symbol, a son standing for his mother. You don't walk that back with a press release." Meredith finally looked up. "So, what do we do? Apologize for having standards?" "You insulted the man's mother," Clinton shot back. "In public, during the deal signing. What did you think was going to happen?" "We've said worse things to each other in this house," Meredith replied coolly. "Exactly," Eleanor said, closing her binder with a snap. "And maybe that's the real problem." At Brooks Freight, the pressure was more personal. Darius Ingram, Jonathan's cousin, business partner, and co-founder, wasn't just worried, he was livid. They met at their old spot, a modest diner in West Orange with cracked vinyl booths and too much sugar in the coffee. The place where, 15 years ago, they'd sketched their first business plan on napkins. "You made a unilateral decision," Darius said, staring across the table. "You didn't ask, didn't text, just threw away everything we worked for." Jonathan said nothing. "That was our moment, John. That was the leap. Our kids would have been set for life, and you blew it. For what? A headline?" Jonathan looked down at the cup in his hands, then looked up. She wasn't just insulted Darius. She was erased, in front of them, in front of me. Darius leaned back. "Then maybe that was her fight to pick, not yours." "No," Jonathan said softly. "She wasn't fighting. She was being stepped on." 2 days later, Brooks Freight's investor line lit up again, but this time with quieter voices. A mid-sized logistics firm from Ohio wanted to talk partnerships. A union representative from Michigan offered warehouse access for a new pilot program. A trucking co-op in Arizona asked if Jonathan would consider a speaking engagement. Something was shifting. Not fast, not loud, but real. And then came the press conference. No velvet rope, no branded backdrop. Just a plain folding table in a conference room meant for 10 people, packed with 20. Jonathan stood at the mic in a navy blazer and khakis. No script. "I didn't cancel the deal because of money," he said. "I canceled it because the second you allow disrespect into the room, it spreads. I wasn't raised that way. And I won't build a future on top of silence." A reporter from CNBC asked, "Was it true that Meredith Montgomery made the comment directly?" Jonathan didn't flinch. "Yes. Loud enough for my mother to hear. Loud enough for others to pretend they didn't." Another reporter asked, "Some might say that's not a reason to walk away from a billion-dollar deal." He paused. "Depends on the kind of company you're trying to build." Outside, support continued to grow. The story hit the Sunday morning circuit. Pastors preached on it. Teachers brought it up in civics classes. A young activist quoted Jonathan's line, "Respect isn't negotiable," during a school board protest in Alabama. And inside the Hathaway, now Montgomery, PR firm, The narrative was slipping further away. They tried to discredit Jonathan subtly, leaked old funding agreements, suggested he was volatile, implied he brought politics into business. But each attempt backfired. Leonard Greer, CEO of Stratus Line Logistics, an earlier partner of Jonathan's, released a public statement. Jonathan Brooks walked away from our deal in 2017 because we refused to raise wages for warehouse staff. I wish I'd made the same choice. Back in Trenton, Eleanor Brooks watched the coverage from her small living room, surrounded by flowers and cards from strangers. She appeared briefly on local news, sitting in a plain chair, hands folded in her lap. "I didn't ask for attention," she said, "but I raised my son to speak when silence costs too much." The clip went viral. Jonathan watched it alone in his office. He hadn't cried in years. But when she said that, "Some money comes with chains and I'm too old to wear chains," he felt something crack loose in his chest. A week later, he gathered his executive team again. No press, no cameras, just them. "We've stabilized," Julian said. "That's the good news." "And the noise is helping, not hurting," Naya added. "We've got new contracts, quiet partnerships, and people want to work with us. Not just because of the fallout, but in spite of it." Jonathan nodded. "Then, let's show them who we are." He grabbed a marker and began sketching on the whiteboard, expansion plans, hiring timelines, a summer event. "No press conference," he said, "no branding. Just food, music, kids, families. Remind everyone what we built, where we came from." "Like a community day?" Naya asked. "No," Jonathan said, "like a family reunion, the kind where everyone gets a plate, no matter where they came from." And as the team leaned in, scribbling notes, smiling quietly, one thing was clear. They weren't just rebuilding, they were rising. Jonathan Brooks didn't intend to become a symbol. He never asked to carry the weight of a movement on his shoulders. He just wanted to build something that lasted, something honest, something that didn't require sacrificing his name or his mother's dignity for a seat at someone else's table. But symbols don't ask permission. They're chosen by moments. And this moment had chosen him. Even as he poured himself into operations, meeting with logistics partners, reassuring staff, updating projections, he could feel the gravity shifting. Not toward him as a CEO, but as a man who said no when the price of yes was too high. And it wasn't just admiration coming his way. It was expectation. A week after the press conference, his assistant handed him an envelope. No return address. Plain off-white, tucked between vendor invoices and marketing proofs. He almost didn't notice it, until he saw the name neatly typed across the front, Jonathan Brooks. Inside was a handwritten letter, the kind people don't write anymore. Cursive loops with slight trembles, the ink pressed into the page like each word had weight. "Mr. Brooks, you don't know me, but I know who you are. My father was the groundskeeper at Montgomery Ridge for over 2 decades. He raised me and my sisters on that job, waking before sunrise, never complaining, always proud even when we were invisible. When I saw what you did for your mother, I cried. Not because I was surprised by how they treated her, but because, for once, someone said no and meant it. You reminded me of him. He never had your platform, but he had your spine. Thank you for standing up. With deep respect, Camille Parker." Jonathan read it twice, then a third time. He folded it carefully and placed it in his inside blazer pocket, right next to where his heart had started beating harder. That night, over dinner in Trenton, he told his mother about it. She said her father worked at Montgomery Ridge for over 20 years, and that I reminded her of him. Eleanor, stirring her tea with quiet grace, didn't speak at first. Then she looked up. Funny, she said softly. How truth finds you, don't matter the road. It'll come through a church sermon or an old photo or a stranger's pen. The next day, Jonathan called Nia Whitlow. I want to find her, he said. Camille Parker? Already did, Nia replied. Teaches 4th grade in Harrisburg, lives in a small apartment. Has a rescue dog named Marvin. She doesn't do social media. Didn't think you'd write back. I don't want to write, Jonathan said. I want to visit, in person. 2 days later, he stood on a narrow stoop in Harrisburg, holding a paper bag with banana bread from a local bakery. Camille opened the door after the second knock. Mid-40s, brown ponytail, jeans, and a school district sweatshirt. She froze. You're... I'm Jonathan, he said. And this is banana bread. I figured you're probably tired of people wanting something from you. She laughed, soft and surprised. Come in before my dog tries to eat you. Inside, her home was modest, lived in. A framed photo sat above the mantel. A man in work boots standing beneath a tall oak tree, rake in hand, pride in his stance. Your father, she nodded, worked that estate like it was his own, never called them sir or ma'am, not once. Said names weren't just manners, they were dignity. They sat with tea, talked for 2 hours, about her father, his values, the weight of knowing when to speak, and the greater weight of staying quiet. He would have liked you, she said at the end, not because you made it, but because you knew when to walk away. Back in New York, the world hadn't slowed. It had sharpened. The Montgomerys, reeling from failed PR spins and hemorrhaging contracts, weren't retreating quietly. Their legal team filed motions suggesting breach of agreement. Whispers circulated about Jonathan's early funding history. Claims of volatility, of instability, of injecting personal politics into business. The tactic was familiar: discredit the man to erase the message. But this time, it didn't work. Stratus Line's CEO, Leonard Greer, issued a public statement. Jonathan didn't walk away from our deal in 2017 for ego. He walked because we refused to approve wage raises for drivers. I should have followed him out the door. I didn't. That's on me. One by one, others spoke out. Warehouse managers, former interns. A retired vet who'd worked a dispatch for 6 years posted a video on TikTok. He's the real thing. Taught me how to run a shift, not from a spreadsheet, but from the floor. And then came Eleanor. Seated in her small living room, in front of a borrowed camera and a cup of tea, she looked directly at the lens and said, I didn't raise my son to be a businessman. I raised him to be a man who stands even when standing means losing something. The clip landed like thunder. Within hours it was trending again, but this time not as scandal, as legacy. At the next executive meeting, Nia closed the door behind her with a deep breath. We've turned the corner, she said. Investors are calling again. Some who pulled out want back in, quietly, of course. Julian, the COO, added, 3 mid-size freight firms want to talk long-term partnerships, and the boards stopped pacing the floors. Jonathan nodded. Because we stood for something. Nia corrected him. Because you stood for something. He looked around the room. Familiar faces. Worn hands. People who'd built the company from forklifts and folding tables. Not politics, not privilege. They want me to speak now, he said. Lead panels, sit on committees, be the face of some new movement. Julian leaned forward. Maybe that's what comes next. You built the business. Now build the voice. Jonathan looked unsure. I never wanted to be a symbol, he said. Symbols get worshipped or torn down. Neither feels like a life. Nia smiled gently. Then be a builder. Again. But build something that lives. That night, Jonathan stood in his mother's backyard, the same patch of grass where she'd taught him to plant basil 2 summers earlier. She wore an old church dress, faded but pressed. Bent over the planter box, she moved methodically, with the calm of someone who'd weathered far worse storms than headlines. "You all right with all this attention?" he asked, not looking at her directly. "Attention don't bother me," she replied, "but I know what comes with it." "What do you mean?" "They don't like it when we leave rooms with our heads high. Makes them feel small, so they try to make us feel smaller." He sat on the porch steps. "They're still spinning it, Ma, saying I blew up the deal over nothing." She finally turned to him. "You know it wasn't nothing. And anybody who says that don't know the cost of respect." He nodded slowly. "Darius is still upset. Feels like I took something from the family." She walked over and sat beside him. "Every family's got their storm. But if you bend in the middle of it, what do you pass on?" Jonathan said nothing. "I just wanted to protect you," he whispered. "You did," she said. "But it wasn't just about me anymore. It's about what you represent now. Don't run from that." And so he didn't. Weeks later, Jonathan stood at a podium, not in front of press, but beneath a white tent in a parking lot, folding tables lined with food, kids darting between face painters and book drives. Warehouse workers shook hands with HR staff. Drivers played cornhole with IT reps, the first ever Brooks community reunion. Not a conference, not a campaign, a reminder. Jonathan took the mic briefly. "I turned down $900 million. People said I was crazy, but this is worth more than any check." The applause wasn't explosive. It was warm, real. And just as he was stepping down, a teenager approached, holding a laminated name tag that read intern. "Mr. Brooks," she said, breathless. "My dad told me nobody in business ever keeps their morals. Said it's all just money, but you—" He smiled. "Number my mother did." The girl beamed. Jonathan turned and looked out at the lot. Food trucks, folding chairs, laughter. He finally understood. Redemption doesn't come from revenge. It comes from refusing to be anything less than who you were raised to be. The final test didn't come in the form of a lawsuit or a headline. It came in a quiet hospital room under soft fluorescent lights, where time felt slower and everything smelled faintly of hand sanitizer and ginger ale. Eleanor Brooks had fainted at her weekly Bible study. Nothing alarming, the nurse said, just a moment of dizziness. But when Jonathan got the call, he didn't wait. He left a strategy meeting mid-sentence and drove the length of the turnpike with his jaw clenched and one hand gripping the wheel like it was the only thing keeping him together. When he stepped into her room, she looked more annoyed than afraid. "I told them I just stood up too fast," she said, sipping from a plastic cup. "Didn't need all this fuss." But he saw the truth in her hands, the slight tremble, the fatigue in her eyes, the way she rested just a little heavier against the pillow than usual. The tests came back the next day, nothing immediately dangerous. But the message was clear. Time doesn't pause, even for icons. Life has edges. And legacy, if it's to mean anything, must move from speeches to structure, from standing tall to building something that outlives you. That night, as they sat watching reruns of Sanford and Son on the hospital television, Eleanor didn't say much. But then, without turning from the screen, she said, "You've done good, baby." Jonathan chuckled. "Did you just call me baby in front of the nurse? I brought you into this world. I get to call you what I want." He smiled, but something in him shifted. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you told me, about not handing down silence." She turned, waiting, I want to start something, a foundation, for drivers, warehouse crews, their families, healthcare, childcare, tuition help, real support, not just brochures and job fairs. Action. She didn't reply at first, but then her mouth curved into a soft smile, the kind that told him she already knew this moment was coming. That sounds like you. I want to name it after you. Her eyes welled up, even as she tried to hide it with a cough. You don't need to do that. I do, he said, because you built me. Weeks later, the Eleanor Initiative launched. Not with flash, but with purpose. No red carpet, just a video, a mission, and 3 nonprofit partnerships to begin. It caught fire. Not because it was trendy, but because it was true. And at the first family reunion event, food, laughter, and music filling the parking lot of their first warehouse, Jonathan stood beneath a white tent, holding a microphone like it was sacred. I turned down $900 million, he said. People called me crazy, but this right here, this is worth more than any check. As the crowd applauded, he looked up at the sky, thinking of Camille's father, of Darius, of his own father, long buried but never far, of the moment he walked his mother back to that SUV, of everything that broke and everything they built. And finally, he understood. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you live through, and what you refuse to let die in silence. What would you have done in Jonathan's shoes? Would you walk away from $900 million to protect someone you love, or stay silent for the sake of success? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. We dive deep into powerful true-to-life stories that explore ethics, family, race, and resilience in modern America. Join our community so you never miss a chance to feel, reflect, and be inspired. Your voice matters, and your next story might be the one that changes someone's life.